Alright guys, today we're going to look at lecture 16 in our Causes of the American Revolution series. We're going to follow up on what we learnt about last time to do with the coercive acts, and today's lecture is called the Coercive/Intolerable Acts, a Visual Analysis. Last time we looked at the coercive acts and we identified the cause, the triggers, and the consequences of the coercive acts, or if you're an American, the intolerable acts. We identified that the cause was mainly the British desire to restrain American colonists, and that restraint came in the form of removing certain natural rights from the people of Massachusetts. The consequences were dire for the people of Massachusetts, pretty much the shutting down of Boston Harbor, the military government in Boston, the provision to loyalists to seek protection from the British government when they felt oppressed, and also the British ability to claim Boston property for their own purposes, mainly to house standing armies. Today we are going to be able to analyze a visual representation of the coercive act's effect on America by Paul Revere. Okay. So this is our image that we're going to look at today, and its title is The Able Doctor, or America Swallowing the Bitter Drought. And as I said before, when we look at a visual analysis, we should always do a literal analysis and then a symbolic analysis. And as we do both of those, we are looking at the foreground and the background. So what I'm going to do is pretty much go through step by step as to what I have observed, and then I'm going to interpret my observations for you. Remember, literal analysis is what we purely observe, and symbolic is actually understanding what those observations mean within the context of the visual image. So my first observation is that there is a woman being held down, not wearing very much clothing, and the woman is America, as stated in the title. It says, The Able Doctor, or America Swallowing the Bitter Drought. I can see, and whilst I'm jumping ahead a little bit here, I can see that there's this person in the foreground, drinking or being forced to drink some kind of tea, and so the bitter drought must be the tea. Therefore, America is swallowing the bitter drought. So the person in the foreground lying down must be America. So I can see a woman being held down who is America. I can see a man in royal clothes pouring tea into America's mouth and holding her by the throat. Now this is Lord North. Now this is where the really good historians will rise above the historians that just know the facts. People who really know their American history will be able to identify that this is Lord North. His face is very is seen in a lot of visual images, and he's always depicted in the same way, with quite a big cheeks and a big face. So I can see from this that he is Lord North, but there are other hints that I'm going to talk about in a few minutes that allude to the fact that this is Lord North. So I can see a man in royal clothes pouring tea into America's mouth and holding her by the throat, and you can see that he is holding her by the throat using his left hand. I can see America spitting tea in Lord North's face. Now, obviously, there's nothing really saying that it's tea, except for the fact there's a teapot. And so, using that logic, it's obvious that America is spitting tea into Lord North's face. Another observation I've had is the fact that there are two men who are dressed very similarly to Lord North, so they must be also of royal descent or connected to Parliament maybe, or the House of Commons. So there are two men holding down America, so they must be in favour of what Lord North is doing, and one of them is looking under America's cloth or America's dress. I can see in the top left-hand corner two men discussing the scene. They're both wearing hats, which makes them different to the three men in the front. The three men aren't wearing hats, but there are also other things that make these two men different. We can see that their dress is very different to the others. One one on the right here has got like a cape, and the one on the left, whilst he looks royal, he wearing a different shade of uniform to the men in the front here, and also his actual outfit is different. I can see a woman who can't watch the scene, holding a spear and a shield. She's covering her eyes, and she's got her spear leaning up against her, and she's holding in her right hand a shield on the ground. And then on the far right of the scene, I can see a man also dressed differently to the others, holding a sword that says military law. It's probably a little bit hard to see, but if you can zoom in on the actual image, you can see on the sword there's an inscription and it says military law. Other things I can see in the background now, I can see the words Boston cannonaded. So I can see that the landscape of Boston has been titled Boston cannonaded. I can see in Lord North's pocket a piece of paper, and the piece of paper says Boston Port Bill. And that is our massive clue to the fact that this is talking about the coercive acts, that the Port Bill was one of the coercive acts. And also I can see in the foreground here that a piece of paper ripped saying Boston Petition. All right, so that's my literal analysis. I've gone through what I can see and what I can observe. Now I'm going to conduct my symbolic analysis, meaning I'm going to interpret what I can see to make better sense of the image and ultimately make a message out of what Paul Revere's image is trying to communicate. All right, so I'm going to go through exactly the same steps again. I can see America being held down by three men. America is obviously being attacked and held ransom. I can see Lord North, and Lord North is holding America by the throat in his left hand. He is choking her, and he is enforcing the Tea Act onto her. And we can assume that he's enforcing some kind of Tea Act on her because of the teapot that he's holding in his hand. And we also know that the Tea Act was a trigger for the Boston Tea Party, which was then a trigger for the Boston Port Bill, which is in his pocket, which is ultimately the coercive acts. So we can see Lord North is choking America and is enforcing America to drink the Tea Act. We can see that America is refusing to accept the act because she is spitting the tea that Lord North is pouring into her mouth. She is spitting it back into his face. And so this is a controversial image that Paul Revere is creating here. He's not showing that America is taking the Tea Act and accepting it. She's actually spitting it back in the mouth or in the face of Lord North. So that is communicating to us that America is not accepting the Tea Act. She is refusing to accept the Tea Act. Other things that we've noticed that we need to unpack symbolically is that there are two other British men kneeling, holding down America, and they are obviously British loyalists because they are wearing similar clothing to Lord North. The one on the right looks like he might be a judge, where the one on the left looks like he's a parliamentarian. And it's interesting that the one on the left is peering underneath the cloth of America. And it's a message by Paul Revere, possibly saying that the parliamentarians are perverted people. They are evil people. They are trying to subject America. And even if we really wanted to go to the next step, these parliamentarians are looking to even rape America. And this is like that's an extreme statement, but when we really look at it, you know, the one on the left, the man on the left looking under the cloth, is also got America's ankles bound, and the one on the right is holding America's wrists down. So she's definitely imprisoned, or she's definitely um, held to ransom by these three men. It is a scene that makes us think of the idea of, a woman, unfortunately, being sexually abused. What else is there that's symbolic? Well, again, knowing history helps you, and I can identify for us that on the left, the two men discussing and watching on, it is the French and the Spanish. The one on the far left is a Frenchman, and on the far right is a Spaniard. And the Spaniard's probably the most obvious one because of the attire that he's wearing, the cape, the big feather in the cap, and those hats are very authentic, or reflective of Spanish lifestyle. And they are discussing what is going on in America, or happening to America, and they are in horror. They are observing. The Spanish are pointing their finger, and this is symbolic because at the same time, the French and the Spanish have colonies very close to the 13 American colonies. The Spanish have populated a lot of Southern America, and as we know, the French were once colonists in Canada, and so we know that both of these countries, or both of these empires, have a lot of interest in what is happening to America and the relationship between America and Britain. And this is what we can see here. We can see also in the background the lady, who is Britannia. She's the representation of Britain, and she can't watch. And again, another thing that history tells us is that many parts of the British Empire were represented by women. So, for example, in this image, we've got Great Britain being represented as Britannia, a woman. We've got America being represented by a woman. Also, other parts of Great Britain, such as Ireland, are represented by women. The warrior Erin is an Irish woman, and she represents Ireland. Feel free to Google Erin, the warrior of Ireland, or the representation of Ireland, and she'll pop up. And she looks very, very similar to Britannia. She holds a shield, and in this case, we've got Britannia just not being able to watch. Is she embarrassed? Is she humiliated by what Lord North and the other two loyalists are doing? Is she sympathizing with another woman? Again, we have to remember that everything that's in these visual documents, they are put there for a very specific reason. So maybe Paul Revere has put Britannia there not just to identify Great Britain's response to Lord North's coercive acts, but also maybe because he recognizes that women share, or can more easily share similar emotions, and so she's feeling sympathy for what America is going through at the moment. And then we've got the other man on the far right holding America ransom to military law. He's holding the sword that is got inscribed on it military law, and he's standing by, possibly waiting to attack, possibly waiting to enforce it. And we know that military law is another consequence of the coercive acts, the fact that Thomas Gage was made the governor of Massachusetts. We've got the title of the background, Boston Cannonaded, and the word cannonaded is derived from the word cannon, and to be cannonaded would mean to be engulfed or surrounded by cannons that are constantly firing at you. And that image itself makes us think of being consistently attacked from all sides, and that what that background is trying to communicate. Boston cannonaded, Boston being constantly attacked by cannon fire, or not cannon fire, by taxes, by legislations, time and time and time again, the British are enforcing their authority over Boston. And so Boston is being cannonaded, they're constantly being attacked. We've got the call to the Coercive Acts in the fact that the Boston Port Bill is poking at the pocket of Lord North, dead center of the image. And we also got the petition on the floor next to America, and it looks like it's being ripped up. It's Boston's voice not being heard. It was once being held by America, and now has been ripped up by the loyalists and is helpless. It can't move. It's subjected to just lying there as America gets tortured. And I guess also we can contrast how the Coercive Acts are upright and they're intact, and the Boston Petition is on the floor and it looks like it's been ripped up. So that's my symbolic analysis. So I've done a literal and a symbolic. I've looked at the foreground and the background. And now we have to tie it together. And we tie it together when we get asked this question: outline the impact of the Coercive Acts on America. Or remember, in the SAC and in the exams, this task word outline comes up time and time and time again. So we have to be able to identify what outline means. Outline means synthesize. Take all the parts of that image and create a response. What are you responding to? Well, you're responding to the question, which is, what is the impact? Outline the impact of the Coercive Acts on America. So as the student, in this case, I have to communicate what the impact of the Coercive Acts were on America by using the source, taking all the parts of the source and synthesizing it, outlining the source, and communicating what I think is the impact. So I'm going to read this to you, and then I'm going to deconstruct this response. Paul Revere demonstrates in Source 1 how the Coercive Acts had a negative impact on America through his depiction of America as an unclothed woman being held at ransom by men dressed in royal attire. Each of the men, grappling America by the wrists, throat, and feet, are in support of the Boston Port Act, one of the Coercive Acts, as depicted in the united attack on America and having this legislation in the pocket of one of them. The support of this legislation is also illustrated by being contrasted to the other piece of paper in the foreground, titled Boston Petition, which has been ripped up. Furthermore, Revere communicates to his audience that the Coercive Acts have had a negative impact on America by depicting the other woman in the scene as sorrowful and powerless, as she has let down her shield and spear and covered her eyes so she does not see what is taking place. This is juxtaposed by the upright man standing to the right of this woman, who is holding a sword with the inscription Military Law, which both recalls another legislation that was part of the Coercive Acts and seemingly supports the men who are holding down America. Now that's 205 words. Remember, our first response, our first question has to be answered with about 200 words. Okay. Now, first observation, I haven't included every single detail from the source in my response. I haven't talked about Boston cannonaded. I haven't talked about the French and the Spanish men. However, whatever evidence that I have used to explain why there is a negative impact on America by the Coercive Acts. Now, it's important that we, first of all, start with the statement of my response to the question, which was outline the impact. So we have to discuss whether or not it's a positive or negative impact, or it could be both. And you could argue for both, so long as you provide the evidence. But in this case, I think Paul Revere is definitely communicating that the Coercive Acts have had a negative impact. And so I've clearly stated that in the first sentence, as you can see in the blue. I've also signposted that I'm using Source 1, and Source 1 is created by Paul Revere. And you can see that I've signposted twice throughout this. Remember, signposting is an important skill that we have to use to make sure that we are always coming back and using the source. It helps us, but it also helps the assessor. And then in the black and the pink, what I've tried to do is show you where I've used direct evidence from the source, and then when I've actually explained or linked or analyzed that evidence um, on reflection of the question. Okay, so every time you see black is or words bolded, that is direct evidence, and then when you see pink, I've tried to explain what I mean using the evidence. Okay, so again, this is just to clarify what I've just said here. So obviously, what I've done is I've taken my literal interpretation, which is the black bolded evidence, okay, and I've just explained very specifically. And remember, we have to be super specific with visuals. We have to say that it's not just a woman; it's an unclothed woman. How are the men grappling America? By the wrists, the throat, and feet. Um, uh, what is the difference between the two legislations? One's in the pocket, one has been ripped up. So we have to be ultra specific about what the evidence or what is actually being depicted in the image. Okay, and that's our evidence. Notice that I haven't made any statement about Lord North, the Spanish or the French. I have because remember, it's not the question isn't asking for our prior knowledge here. We have to make sure that we are just taking what's in the source and spitting it out onto paper. We can't use any prior knowledge. Now, I've used prior knowledge in my analysis. I've connected dots. I've talked about Britannia and Lord North, for example, but in this, I haven't actually mentioned their names. I've had to word it in such a way to be able to avoid that. So when I talked about Lord North, I've just talked about a man. When I've talked about Britannia, I've talked about a woman holding, covering her eyes, holding a shield and a spear. And so it helps the assessor when they read this. Instead of you saying Britannia, you are still talking about the same person, but you're just describing who they are. And that is much more impressive in the eyes of the assessor. So it's a very, very important skill that we have to continually work on. The fact that we can't use any prior knowledge in the actual answer. Of course, go ahead. We can definitely use prior knowledge to understand the source. You have to do that. Otherwise, you really can't even analyze it. You can't put it in the context of the American Revolution. If you saw the document Boston Port Act, but you didn't know about the Coercive Acts or the Boston Tea Party, then you wouldn't know what that piece of documentation hanging out of Lord North's jacket is. So you obviously have to use prior knowledge, but you have to keep that prior knowledge in your head. And then when you actually write your answer, you have to make sure that you leave the prior knowledge in your head and you communicate the prior knowledge through the use of specific evidence. And I can't emphasize it enough. Specific evidence. And then you take that evidence and you link it back to your answer. Okay, I've said negative impact, so I've talked about the united attack on America, the contrast between the two documents that are in the actual image, the negative impact, the juxtaposition of the man holding the sword of military law and Britannia, talking about the legislation and how it poses a negative impact. So, in the pink, you can see I've really just taken everything that I've bolded and continually come back to my contention that it's a negative impact. Okay, I've probably gone on way too long about this, but I want to make sure that you guys are very clear about what's expected when it says outline. No prior knowledge has to appear. You have to use your writing skills to communicate that knowledge in a way that is strictly using the visual source. Signpost it, answer the question in the first sentence, use plenty of evidence that you can literally see in the background and foreground, literal observations and very clear and specific observations, and then link that evidence to your answer to the question. All right, next time we're going to look at the powder alarms and the First Intercontinental Congress. We are nearly at war. We are starting to see united fronts by the colonies in the form of intercontinental congresses. If you got any questions, please post them on the Google Classroom or see me in person. But from now until class, find other sources that in your textbook. Look through the textbook and find examples of visual sources and just ask yourself a question that has the word outline in it. Okay, outline and create your own question. And that way you can continually practice communicating the knowledge in the way that we have to communicate it for the exam.